Somebody else could have maybe called a clash of civilizations between an engineering state and a lawyerly society. Is this an insight that came to you in a single moment that you arrived at kind of over study and over time?
You know, Dan, your book has raised, gotten a lot of responses, and a lot of very positive response, and a lot of very thoughtful responses. America's basically always been run by lawyers back to the founding, you know, the framers, the founders, et cetera, through the 1800s, through the 1900s. So that even in our building phase, it was lawyers more or less running the show. What's your take on that? And so is the issue not so much that we're run by lawyers, but the lawyers have become more lawyerly, or something else has happened? I'm just curious how you respond to that historical observation.
大家好，欢迎来到本期视频。先来介绍一下背景啊，本期视频的主人公叫王丹，他前段时间写了一本爆款书《极速前进：中国对未来的探索》。这本书一出，直接冲上了《纽约时报》畅销榜，还被《金融时报》、《外交事务》、《大西洋月刊》轮番报道。当西方还震惊于中国的发展速度，甚至开始自我怀疑，我们是不是太民主了？难道只有威权体制才能搞出这样的成绩？就在这个节骨眼上，王丹的这本书出现了。他在书里抛出了一个炸裂的观点：中国之所以发展如此之快，既不全是威权的效率，也不全是民主的失灵，而在于中国是一个工程师国家，而美国已变成了一个律师型社会。工程师搞建设，想的是怎么建起来；律师搞诉讼，想的是怎么叫停一切。就靠这个框架，王丹被西方主流媒体评为理解当代中国最具洞察力的声音之一。然后我们再来聊聊王丹这个人。王丹1992年出生于云南，7岁随父母移民加拿大，父亲是软件工程师，母亲是电视台主持人。他是典型的理工科移民家庭，他本科读的是哲学，毕业时拿了经济学和哲学双学位。他自己的身份认同是加拿大人，毕业以后去了硅谷科技公司干市场营销。2017年，他以龙州金讯科技分析师的身份回到中国，在香港、北京、上海生活了整整6年，完整经历了动态清零的3年。2023年，他回到美国，先到耶鲁法学院中国研究中心做研究员，后来加入斯坦福胡佛研究所做研究员，并在此期间出版了前面提到的这本书。注意啊，胡佛研究所是美国顶级保守派智库，里根、小布什、尼克松都跟他深度关联，所以王丹这番工程师 vs 律师的论述得看清楚他背后的金主。再说一下这场访谈的主持人，一位是拜登的国家安全顾问杰克·沙利文，另一位是他的首席副手乔恩·费纳。沙利文1976年生，是美国60年来最年轻的国家安全顾问，他是耶鲁法学博士，罗德学者。奥巴马时期是希拉里的副幕僚长，国务院政策规划主任。拜登上台后，他也成了第28任国家安全顾问。乌克兰、加沙、中美关系，所有重大决策都有他的手笔。费纳耶鲁法学院毕业，罗德学者，哈佛本科，牛津硕士，后来从白宫学者一路做到国务院政策规划主任，前国务卿克里的幕僚长，再到拜登的首席副国家安全顾问。这2位都是民主党主流建制派，所以光从背景来看就有很多的信息量。好，我们话不多说，来看正片吧。
And I want to stipulate up front, just in the spirit of full disclosure, you're being interviewed by 2 lawyers here, but this is not an ambush. We don't mean it that way at all. Can you just lay out the basic argument that you make in the book about the challenges associated with this lawyerly society? And then we were both curious, is this an insight that came to you in a single moment that you arrived at kind of over study and over time? This results in actually like a new insight about how things are organized.
I should say also that I have a little bit of lawyering tendency in myself as well. I think the Yale Law School implicates all 3 of us. And in thinking through, some of the challenges that the United States faces today, the pretty severe housing shortages in big cities like New York, Boston, San Francisco, LA, which suffered from some pretty devastating fires, which is still barely rebuilding. We're taking subways in New York City that are over 100 years old. We're taking train lines. The new Excella is somehow slower than the previous Excella. These are sort of the problems that I think the lawyerly society has not been very well set up to solve.
Now, Dan, you pair this observation about the difference between China and the United States with an observation that actually no 2 people are more alike than Americans and Chinese, that They're both exceptionalist societies. You point out a number of similarities. I think a lot of people in the U.S. and probably a lot of people in China will be surprised by that observation. Can you say a little bit more about what you mean?
I think that the United States and China are the two countries that are really inventing the future. That the future is being financed by Wall Street, invented in Silicon Valley as well as Shenzhen, built out of there. And then we also have this really big, two jealous centers of power, Washington, D.C. and Beijing, in which the elites of both countries sort of view themselves as, we are great powers, and everyone else is a smaller country that has to listen to us. Chinese and Americans are just kind of really friendly. You can go anywhere in Texas, you can go anywhere in China, you can have a conversation. It kind of feels like a warm bath, speaking as a Canadian who drives around America feeling like everything is just very big and very bizarre. And so, as soon as I enter Canada, I kind of just relax a little bit more. But, here in the US and China, things are a little bit more rollicking, I think is a little bit of the word. And I think I contrast that. Being bizarre is mostly a good thing. I think about Europe as well as Japan. Europe is a region that I call the mausoleum economy in the opening page of my book. There's kind of a self-satisfied preening of trying to polish up all of these wonderful museum pieces. And Japan, I think, has been not grown very substantially for much of basically the last 30, 40 years. And so, I think that both of these countries are full of ambitious hustlers. They take all sorts of shortcuts, but then they have this essence of striving that, so there's all sorts of ways in which both countries break down. I think the United States is not very good towards the elderly. The Chinese state is not very good towards young people. One of the issues with being a superpower is that, normal countries don't have such dominance by engineers. In China, in the United States, is all the elites are so many of the political elites are lawyers. Normal countries have more normal sized distributions of professions. So I really think that I'm very cautious about extending this analysis to Germany or to Canada or to India.
So you derive in the book kind of the origins of the lawyerly society in the United States, and you talk about how it emerged in the 60s as a correction, Robert Moses-esque building boom that took place in infrastructure before that, but that resulted in charges of systemic racism, environmental degradation, and the result, as you describe it, is this vetocracy where nothing gets built and everything can be stopped. And you highlight just one example that we want to give people, which is that in 2008, both China and California began planning high-speed rail lines. China completed its Beijing-Shanghai line in 2011 at a cost of $36 billion. California spent 17 years building a small segment of its line, with the current cost estimates running to $117 billion. So therein sort of lies the problem. But it does lead us to this question, which is ultimately what we want is Robert Moses-like outcomes, being able to build big and important things at speed, at scale, but without Robert Moses methods of leveling entire low-income neighborhoods, et cetera, et cetera. Is that achievable? Can we hit that sweet spot?
I think that we can hit that sweet spot. There are plenty of countries. Let's say, here's where I want to praise the mausoleum economies a little bit more. Japan, Western Europe have built excellent infrastructure without expropriating people, without horrible environmental damage in, let's say, Tokyo or Copenhagen. I spent quite a bit of time in Denmark last summer. Denmark has built these amazing, Copenhagen built these amazing subway stations. They're super clean, cleaner than in Asia. They're fully automated. And so, you don't have these workers who demand that, as you do in New York City subway, that there must be 2 conductors per train. And, I don't think that we necessarily associate the Danish as well as the Japanese with really horrible rights problems. We don't associate really serious cost overruns with them. And so, the question is not so much whether democracies can build. I think that, That is almost the wrong framing. There's all sorts of ways in which rich societies have been able to do basic things like build homes. There are parts of the United States that has been able to build quite a lot, and we don't have to reach back into the past of Robert Moses, of the Army Corps of Engineers, of Department of Agriculture spraying DDT absolutely through everywhere. There are examples today in the United States which is able to build. There are examples overseas of friends and allies which are able to build. So let's not get too caught up on, is authoritarianism the right framing? I say, there are successes in our backyard. Let's look at them and build in our backyard too.
Dan, your book has gotten a lot of responses, and a lot of very positive response, and a lot of very thoughtful responses. One guy named Jonathan Sine, I thought, wrote one of the more interesting and thoughtful responses to the book. It was extremely positive and sympathetic to your argument. But he did make this one note where he said, America's basically always been run by lawyers back to the founding, the framers, the founders, et cetera, through the 1800s, through the 1900s. So that even in our building phase, it was lawyers more or less running the show. What's your take on that? And so is the issue not so much that we're run by lawyers, but the lawyers have become more lawyerly, or something else has happened? I'm just curious how you respond to that historical observation.
The United States has always been governed by lawyers. So if we take a look at the first 13 U.S. presidents, everyone from George Washington to Abraham Lincoln, 10 of them were lawyers. The other 3 were generals. So the lawyerly instinct has been in the United States for a very long time. I think that the United States used to be an engineering state up until basically 1970. And so the United States built all sorts of railways, built canal systems through New York, skyscrapers in Chicago and Manhattan, high-speed, the interstate highway program, Manhattan Project, Apollo missions. We can go on and on with all these amazing achievements of the technological sublime, driven very substantially by the United States government. Something changed in 1970, which was the correction to the excesses of the American engineering state. When New Yorkers got really tired of Robert Moses bulldozing busy neighborhoods, Department of Agriculture spraying too many chemicals around, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers essentially dammed every river in the American West, there needed to have been a correction. And what happened was that throughout the 1960s, a bunch of students, especially students at especially Harvard Law, Yale Law, a lot of the elite law schools, heard the beckons of Ralph Nader to say, government is part of the problem, that we need to be watchdogs of government. We should not serve inside government, that the lawyers turn from being creative deal makers, working on behalf of Franklin D. Roosevelt to do the New Deal. And then a lot of people's highest calling became social impact litigation, right, to really try to restrain the government. I see that as being quite a big problem with the United States, that it does not want to empower the government to do the sort of things that the government itself sets out to do, that the people demand that the government does.
So, Dan, we've focused a lot in the early part of this conversation on the American side of the equation. Understandably, it's where we are, and we want to better understand ourselves before we take on the world. But you're also not a romanticizer at all of the Chinese model. You've been one of the people who's best highlighted, I think, the profound human costs, the blind spots associated with a state run by pretty literal-minded engineers who can see human beings sometimes as sort of variables in a macro optimization equation, as opposed to on their own terms. And you came by this honestly. You lived through the COVID lockdown in Shanghai. You've observed the excesses of Three Gorges and kind of other big infrastructure projects that have caused massive human consequences. I was wondering if you could just say a little bit more about what your own experiences in China have taught you about the engineering state and its own deficiencies.
The chief deficiencies, I think, are 2. I think that for the most part, being run by physical engineers is substantially a good thing. That a housing crisis in the United States means surging home prices, whereas a housing crisis in China means spiraling prices because they have, in part because they have overbuilt. There's all of these empty apartment blocks. Which would you rather have? I would have more homes rather than less. China right now is able to deploy so much new electrical power, so much more renewable power infrastructure. Right now, China has about 40 nuclear power plants under construction. The United States has 0. Last year, China deployed about 300 gigawatts of solar. The United States deployed about 30 gigawatts of solar. China's manufacturing as a share of China's GDP is around 25%. The United States is around 9%. And so, they have achieved quite a lot through physical engineering. But the fundamental problem with the physical engineers is that they cannot stop themselves from also being social engineers, from also being population engineers. And so I spent a lot of time in my book talking about the one-child policy as well as zero COVID. Now, I'm not sure if authors are allowed to have a favorite chapter, but my favorite chapter to write was definitely about the one-child policy. Over the 35 years of the implementation, China conducted around 300 million abortions, which is not that much shy of the present population of the United States. They sterilized about 100 million women, 25 million men. Really brought trauma to so many different families, and part of the demographic problems of China today, of having 40 million missing women after insistent femicide, as well as just the broader population decline in China, is directly attributable to the one-child policy. I spend a lot of time thinking about zero COVID, in which people in Shanghai were kept indoors for about 10 weeks in the spring of 2022, when many families went hungry because parents went hungry to save food for the kids, because the municipal government had no plan in place to really deliver food over so severe of a lockdown.
And so you were there during that time?
I was. I left right before Shanghai lockdown, but I was in China throughout all 3 years of zero COVID. I left into the mountains of the southwest in China. My wife and I were on literally the last flight out of China. I had a little bit less faith in the government when it said that the lockdown would last only 8 days. And then I was back in Shanghai throughout the summer. I was in Shanghai when the protests broke out, and I saw some of these protests in which young people had staggered out of these cocktail bars. It was a very spontaneous event. And I'll never forget watching some of these videos, as well as the actual protests in person afterwards, in which people chanted on the streets, "Down with Xi Jinping, down with the Communist Party." This is completely unimaginable for people who have a sense of living in China, seeing the extent of security services patrolling the streets at all times, that people dared to, raise their voices and demonstrate their anger in such a severe way. And this is the sort of thing that all these physical engineers push people to extremes when they also engage in social engineering.
You have this very succinct phrase or sentence, I think, that captures a lot of what you just said, which is that sometimes the only thing scarier than China's problems are Beijing's solutions. But basically what this says to me is that technical problems get technical fixes, whatever the human consequences in some cases. And maybe the corollary of the question we asked you about whether it's possible to hit the sweet spot in the United States between a building without human consequences is, can an engineering state retain a conscience?
Can a state have a conscience? What is the will the White House have a conscience? I wonder. So my feeling is that the Chinese government, the Communist Party, is interested in national greatness, and it will achieve it by hook or by crook. That is its intention. And I think this desire for national greatness, this desire for national respect, that top leader Xi Jinping has this raw desire that he has almost on his sleeve, that he wears almost on his sleeve, that he wants broader recognition, that he wants to be seen as a peer of the United States. And it is exactly this tendency in which China is just, I think, a little bit too scary that is going to block a greater international recognition for a lot of what Beijing really seeks to achieve. And just to be explicit about what I believe about the future of China, my view is that China will not supersede the United States as the overall superpower in every respect over the next few decades. The United States is a financial superpower. It is a cultural superpower. It is a diplomatic superpower, in addition to a military superpower, and so on. China will never be a financial superpower because the engineers are in charge of the financial system with a very strict sense of capital controls. And that makes investors uncomfortable. If you can't be confident that you can get the money out, maybe you don't want to put the money in. And so the engineering state is exactly the impediment to China becoming much more of a financial superpower. They're much more censorious. And so, we can go on and on about all the ways in which, the engineering state has all of these self-limiting features. But I think that the engineering state is also very well set up to do one big thing, that is to do very, very well on advanced manufacturing, on technology, on many aspects of science as well. Such that I expect that China's share of overall manufacturing capacity in the world, I think, will continue going up over the next decade, going up from a very high base. China right now has about 1/3 of the world's manufacturing base. My expectation is that it will hold on to that share and probably go up over the next decade because it has built so many of these competences.
As I was reading Breakneck and then listening to him, I was reminded of the first time I was in the President's Daily Brief with President Obama. This was in the Oval Office back in 2013. I had just become the National Security Advisor to Vice President Biden. And in the room was Barack Obama, the President of the United States, lawyer. Joe Biden, Vice President, lawyer. Tom Donilon, National Security Advisor, lawyer. Tony Blinken, Deputy National Security Advisor, lawyer. Lisa Monaco, Homeland Security Advisor, lawyer. Me, lawyer. And Dennis McDonough, who is not a lawyer, the chief of staff, but was the most lawyerly person in the room by a mile, as I've told him before. And so it did hit home pretty hard. And you mentioned at the beginning of the episode that we're both Yale Law graduates. He himself has operated in the Yale Law ecosystem, as we discussed on the episode. So all of this hit home. And I thought what he said basically about proceduralism, about caution, about the vetocracy, these are all things you and I experienced in government as we were trying to make progress on industrial strategy, on supply chain resilience, on a lot of national security things. Not to mention, of course, an issue that has come very much in the news, our defense industrial base and our ability to produce munitions at speed and scale. And I think America, as a country that cannot build as rapidly or comprehensively as we need to, we felt and saw in so many ways. I guess if I were to say one thing I walked away still having a real question about, it's something you posed to him about how actually in this administration, it's really the technologists, not the lawyers, who are at the center of the policy conversation. And technologists, like lawyers, think they know everything about everything. I guess I will sum up my view on this entire conversation by paraphrasing another question you asked, which is kind of how I think about this whole issue at this point. And that is, how do you produce Robert Moses outcomes without Robert Moses's trail of destruction? Is that really viable? Or is the idea of shifting back to building at speed and scale almost necessarily based on the premise that you're going to have to cut through low-income neighborhoods, environmental regulations, someone's going to be a loser in a real way, and that's just part of the price tag of building? It certainly was in our country. It certainly has been in spades in China, and Dan Wang does a brilliant job of detailing that. But for me, the diagnosis part here is easier. the prescription part of how you actually achieve a greater degree of engineering outcomes without giving up on the protection of the rights of people, of the habitat, of communities. That's a whole other thing. And I think that for me, I've not yet seen either in his project or in the Abundance Project, a particularly clear set of prescriptions for how to achieve that. I know it's not a mechanical formula or an algorithm, but to me, that really is where the rubber hits the road and where policymakers need to center their attention.
好，视频看完了，我们来聊点有意思的。王丹提出的这个工程师国家 vs 律师型社会的框架确实很火，为啥呢？所以这就引出了第一个点，因为这个框架给了西方一个体面的台阶。从2025年前后开始，西方舆论场正在经历一个痛苦的转变，就是接受中国的崛起。过去你可以说中国是威权，这种发展不可持续，可它偏偏就持续了，还越跑越快。当中国的高铁、新能源、制造业实打实的数据摆在面前，你再怎么嘴硬，再怎么抹黑，再遮不住了，那怎么办？承认自己不行吗？那不可能，太丢人了。所以这个时候王丹就出来了，他说中国的成功不是因为它威权，而是因为它是个工程师国家。美国的问题不是因为它民主，而是因为它是个律师型社会。发现了吗？王丹这个框架把民主 vs 威权这个死结悄悄替换成了工程师 vs 律师的职业问题。所以不是美国民主不行，是律师太多，诉讼太多，程序太复杂。不是中国的威权厉害，是因为人家工程师本身就擅长搞建设，多体面啊！既承认了中国崛起的事实，又给了美国国内一个台阶下。不是我们的制度输了，只是玩法不同。现在中国玩得好，我们不丢人，同时还能跟他们学一学。第二，二元对立简化到失真。当然，体面归体面，逻辑归逻辑，把中美治理差异浓缩成工程师 vs 律师，听着很犀利，但在现实里根本找不到这样的纯粹对立。美国历史上那些大工程，洲际公路、曼哈顿计划、阿波罗登月，哪个不是律师掌舵拍板的？罗斯福的内阁里也全是律师，照样也可以搞大建设。王丹自己也承认这一点，但他硬说成因为那个时候的律师身上没有那么多律师气，这就成了循环论证。意思是好的律师其实可以有工程师思维，问题在于现在的律师变坏了。那所以这个工程师 vs 律师的框架作用到底是什么呢？反过来说，他说中国工程师思维虽然很能搞大型建设，但缺点是推到极致就没有人文关怀，搞社会工程很容易把人当成变量看待，比如独生子女政策、疫情期间的动态清零。那我也想知道，美国疫情期间那么放任，死了那么多人，难道就有人文关怀了吗？还有美国的医疗费用那么高，教育贷款压得人喘不过气，底层人民生活艰苦，体制只服务于有钱人等等，难道这就叫有人文关怀了吗？所以我觉得这种说法主要还是起到一个安慰剂的作用。更何况王丹完全忽略了文化、社会和人在这个过程中起到的作用，比如中国的集体主义传统，美国人根深蒂固的个人主义和对政府的不信任等等，我就不展开了。这些都不是工程师或者律师这两个标签能概括的，所以别被工程师 vs 律师的标题带偏了。好了，这期视频就到这里了，本视频仅代表个人观点，欢迎大家在评论区理性交流和补充。另外，制作视频不易，如果您觉得做得不错，感谢您动动手指，一键3连。如果你有更多的想法或建议，也可以在评论区告诉我，我都会看见。我们下期见。